Hi. So have already made a video about secession, but I didn't make all of the arguments I could make for secession in that video because frankly there are too many of them. There's a lot of good arguments for it. It's a good idea. Um, so this is one of the arguments that I think is probably the best to shake people loose from their distaste with the idea. And this is just to sort of shake people's status quo bias up. I think a lot of people, they don't really consider their ideas before they adopt them, like at all. I think they just adopt their ideas based on what's normal in the world around them. And I think that's pathetic. It's kind of, most people in the world, they just get their religion from their parents. Like they don't even like there's so many different religions and they try to kill each other all the time. And yet if you ask the people who try to kill each other, why do you believe in this? They're like, well, my parents believed in it. That's terrifying. That's not a good way to think. That's not a good way for the world to work. So I've got a spectrum because everything has to be a spectrum. I've made a spectrum here. Decentralized on this side. Ow! And centralized on this side. So, secession is kind of a move towards decentralization, right? You got things that are being done at the federal level right now. If you seceded, then some of those things would be done at the state level, and everything, in a way, would be done at the state level, but also the state would be the federal level, so a lot would have to change. I think a lot of people view this as a very, very extreme idea. But I think when you look at some of the other ideas that are less extreme in politics, you'll see that it's not. So let's look at normal liberal values and conservative values here. Okay, here's the normal conservatives. Right, they're under federalism. Okay, federalism. Generally speaking, they believe in states' rights. They believe in our federal system of government, right, where we have a federal government and then the state governments. The alternative to that is called a unitary government, where you don't have the government divided up into smaller segments like states or provinces. You don't have it subdivided. You just have one unitary government. And that seems to be generally what the liberals want. Although the weird thing is that conservatives, I think, are maybe a bit more honest about it in a way. They want states' rights. And a lot of them will even say that they want to abolish the federal government. Maybe that's not most of them. But some of them will even say they want to abolish the federal government. Liberals, on the other hand, a little bit more sneaky. A little bit more sneaky. They are generally dismissive of states' rights. They're critical of states' rights. Usually they just use it as a way of pointing to a hypocrisy of some kind. Oh, well, you say you like states' rights, but now you're going to pass a national abortion ban? Not so states' rights now, are we? Yeah, that's the kind of thing that they usually sort of joke about. They don't usually say explicitly, I do not believe there should be a such thing as state governments. But in practice, issue by issue, they typically don't leave a lot up to the states. So the implication is that maybe ultimately the goal is a unitary state. But that's just outside the Overton window right now. So they're sort of hiding their power level. They're not saying explicitly that that's what they want, right? And maybe that's not a big deal. Maybe you think that states having the country divided into states is a bad idea, and that it should be made into a unitary state. Um, that's a relatively normal thing to think. That's within the realm of reason. So now I'm going to take you outside of the realm of reason. I'm going to introduce you to some new people, okay? If you're a liberal and you generally balk at the idea of states' rights, you might also like the idea of strengthening international law, right? Having a strong United Nations to broach diplomacy between countries that would otherwise be at war with one another. If you take that just a little bit farther, you get this interesting group of people that are the natural next step for what liberals generally advocate. And yet, most of them have never heard of this group of people. These are the World Federalists, or sometimes Young World Federalists. What they want is exactly what it sounds like. They want a federal system, like the United States has, with the one country divided into many states, for the world. So they want a world government, but then they want it to devolve certain power down to individual nations. So some power will be on the level of the world government, while other power will be on the level of individual nations. Personally, I think that's a bad idea. I think that's a real bad idea. But it has its positives. It could kind of coercively pressure states not to go to war with one another, pressure states to be collaborative with one another. With trade, sometimes countries will hoard resources that the rest of the world needs access to, and they'll sort of sell them at a value that's unreasonable. We could, with world government, sort of prevent them from doing stuff like that. Make everybody play the game, and it would give consequence to violations of basic things like human rights. Right? Whenever a country breaks human rights law internationally in some or another conflict, it's really just a gasping moment. Right? It's not. There are no actual consequences. You can break all the human rights laws you want and not actually get stopped or punished in any way. They're not actually laws in the same sense that laws that apply to you are. They're just guidelines. They're more like guidelines, anyways. Um, if you take that to the next step, right, a world federalist system, I would wonder, okay, why would the people who want a unitary state, why would they stop at a federalist system on a global level? After all, we have an enormous country, 330 million people, and we've decided that subdividing that into smaller regions like states, they've decided at least, is a bad idea. They've decided it's a bad idea and that it should be one unitary government. Why wouldn't they decide that on a global level? Why wouldn't that be where it goes? Right? So then at that point, you don't have a world government with limited authorities, bounded by a global constitution that restricts the abilities of that world government, while devolving specific decision-making powers and autonomy down to individual nations to make decisions for themselves. No, you would have a unitary world state, or if you will, a one world government, if you will. So I think there are a lot of conspiracy theorists who believe that there's a small cabal of ambiguously Jews, who control the world and they want a one world government. Um, I don't believe any of that, but I do think that part of what's behind that and why that's so popular on the political right specifically is that they can kind of feel this. They can kind of see that the people who dislike states' rights and federalism, they're going in a direction, right? They can see which way the arrow is headed, and they know where the end of that arrow is, and that gives them pause. That gives them some skepticism. Now, if you go in the other direction, there are some other problems. I'm going to talk about those now. So, there was a Daily Show clip which went viral in regards to abortion, where it was after Roe v. Wade fell. And this is a liberal commentator said, you know what? Why don't we just give the decisions to the states? That's what the conservatives say they want to do. They want to give the decisions to the states, and they were like, okay, well, if we're going to give the decisions to the states to make for themselves, then why not actually, bring it down to the local government level, right? Why not even take it further and bring it down to the local government level? And then if we're going to take it all the way down to the local government level, if you think about it, really the only person who knows anything about this ultimately is the individual person, right? So let's take it out of the community level and let's bring it down to the level of the individual person. So individual people should decide whether or not to get an abortion. That's the way he extended the argument, right? And his point was that if you really take the states' rights thing, the decentralization thing down to its natural conclusion, you end up with a pro-choice position. Um, the problem with that is that this is coming from a liberal. So they don't believe that about everything. They just believe it about abortion. They don't believe that about every single thing. But there is a group of people who do believe that about everything. Anarcho-capitalists. They actually do believe that. They actually believe, let's take the decentralization thing all the way down to its natural conclusion, which is why over here I have individualism, because that's ultimately where it goes. I do have a step on the way to individualism here, which is local communes / city states, because you'll notice a lot of anarchist ideologies kind of stop short of pure individualism. They either are anarcho-capitalist ideologies where they have like city states where you vote by your feet by changing from one city state to the other. Sometimes these are called special economic zones. Singapore is a real world example of a city state / special economic zone that was allowed to do some very experimental stuff with its regulation, and as a result has attracted a lot of outside investment and business, and it's usually seen as a example of why these libertarian city-states work in practice. And then local communes is on the other end of things. That's like communist anarchists or just communists in general a lot of the time want to start communes, little communities that live together and practice moneyless egalitarian forms of living horizontally on just a community level, doing away with the state. So you take that all the way to here and you get individualism. So what's my problem with individualism? Well, that could be an entire other video, but a couple of things right off the bat. I don't think it's a coincidence that most individualist experiments end up with a lot of pedophiles, because if you really take the whole individual freedom of choice thing to its natural conclusion, then you do away with the human limitations of choice. You kind of have to treat people as fully rational creatures for the full individualist worldview to make sense. And that starts to break down around the edges. And one of those big edges is that when we're babies, we're definitely not fully rational creatures. And there's a gradual biological process where we become not babies anymore. And it's not an instant thing. So the irrational to rational is like a slow, gradual thing that happens. And so to the extent that you can say it's good to delegate autonomy down to individuals, you probably wouldn't want to say that about children individuals. So I think that you go too far in that direction and there's some stuff. That's one of the first ones. That's one of the most blatant ones. But if you start to really tug at, well, where else are we irrational? Where else are we not fully in the best position to make decisions for ourselves? I think that's where you'll start to find good critiques of individualism. So having established that, let's return to the original idea of secession here, right? It doesn't look really that crazy now. And I think my question I would ask to critics of it is, what are your criticisms? I've talked to people in real life. We have a free state movement here in New Hampshire, and they get talked about a lot. And a lot of liberals here in New Hampshire laugh at them. And when they talk about secession, one of the things that I've heard them bring up is, well, I don't want to have to show my ID or go through border patrol every time I drive to Vermont. And it's like, well, okay, but you don't want to have to show your ID or go through border control whenever you drive to Mexico or Canada either. Like, it's just a matter of degrees here. Uh, if you're going to be of that belief, why not take it further? Yeah, you're right. Those border controls and those showing your IDs, those can be annoying. Maybe we get rid of them. Or maybe we do it by making a Mexico, Canada, America alliance, make a unified North America. I just think if you're going to make that kind of an argument, then you should have the balls to push in that direction. And I think that the fact that they don't means that they don't believe in that argument very hard. They don't have a lot of confidence in that actual idea. I don't think they're confidently pro-centralization. I don't think they're consciously pro-centralization. I think they've just tacitly accepted that the scale of things is what it is. And I think you got to ask, does your opinion change depending on where you are, right? Because I feel very confident that critics of secession would feel the exact same way, whether they're living in the US with 330 million people, or China with more than 1 billion people, or Australia with only 11 million people. I feel like they would feel the exact same way no matter where they are, that the country should not get any bigger, it should not incorporate any other territories, it shouldn't become any kind of an international federal nation, and it also shouldn't shrink or subdivide. It shouldn't do either of those things. It should stay more or less where it is, and then maybe like a tiny inch in one direction. And I think it's just status quo bias. At the end of the day, most of the tension here is apolitical, and it has nothing to do with pro-centralization or anti-centralization. It has everything to do with the status quo.